types comes from the Greek. We have types, or also known as typology. What is a type? A type is a person, a place, or a thing, or an event in the Old Testament that prefigures the reality of Christ in the New. There are countless types of Christ in the Old Testament. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that the rock was Christ. And what he means there is that the rock that the Israelites found came in the wilderness, the rock that Moses struck, and then it gave them water in the wilderness. That rock was a type of Christ. Christ is the one who in the New Testament gives us the water of new life. So what are some different types that I want to look at? First, I want to look at the type of Isaac. If we go back to the famous scene of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, when Abraham is called by God to offer up a sacrifice, this is from Genesis 22. This is a very famous passage, but we remember if we look at a couple different scenes from it, we see that in that, Isaac is Abraham's faithful son. We often think about it in terms of Abraham's sacrifice, that Abraham is called to sacrifice his only son. But we remember that Isaac himself was called to cooperate in that sacrifice. It is Isaac himself who is actually offered, or who is going to be offered. And Isaac is the faithful son who carries the wood for his own sacrifice on the top of Mount Moriah. He asks his father Abraham, and this is Genesis 22:7. "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answers, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering." That's Genesis 22:8. God eventually sends his son to stop Abraham from, after seeing Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his only son. But what happens, then Abraham looks over and he sees the ram. And he sees a ram there and he sacrifices the ram. But what happened to the lamb? Abraham had promised that God himself would provide the lamb. And he named that place, that Mount Moriah, he named it Yahweh Yireh. And the latter half of Yireh becomes the root for Jeru. And the whole town is called Salem, the area is Salem, so it becomes Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is that very place where Abraham offered, or almost offered, his son Isaac. And God then pronounces a universal blessing on Abraham in Genesis 22. He says, "By your descendants shall all the nations bless themselves because you have obeyed my voice." So God promises to Abraham, because of Isaac's sacrifice and his sacrifice, a blessing that will go to all the nations. Abraham's descendants continue to wait, even when Abraham's descendants are in Egypt, and they are liberated from Egypt by divine action, divine intervention. And during the Exodus, they cross over the Red Sea. Before they do so, they have to celebrate the Passover, and they celebrate the Passover lamb. So the lamb again becomes the sign of God's deliverance of Israel. But the Israelites knew that God had still not provided that lamb, that the lamb that he had promised Abraham, that he himself would provide, he has not yet been provided. So they continued to wait for it. The next time where this theme comes up is in Solomon's temple, which in 2 Chronicles 3, chapter 3, verse 1, we read that Solomon began to build the temple of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So on the very spot where Abraham, many centuries before, had been willing to offer Isaac, and where Isaac, the faithful son, had been willing to offer himself, we now have the very temple at which sacrifices will be offered to keep God's covenant. And yet again, the lambs are sacrificed here. But the lambs are not provided by God himself. The lambs are provided by Israel. Israel is to provide the lambs to be sacrificed at the temple. We still have to wait for God himself to provide the lamb. All of this gives the proper context then for understanding John the Baptist, his exclamation at the beginning of the Gospel of John. In John 1:29, we read, John sees Jesus and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." What is the Lamb of God? Well, this Lamb of God is the Lamb of God that Israel's been waiting for. The Lamb of God that was promised to Abraham, or that Abraham prophesied back in Genesis 22. The Lamb of God that was foreshadowed in the Passover lamb. The Lamb of God that was foreshadowed in the lamb sacrificed in the temple. That now the Lamb of God has come and that Christ will be the Lamb of God. Christ will be the Lamb of God whose sacrifice will reunite all of Israel and all the whole world to God. And actually it's at this point that that promise to Abraham in Genesis 22 that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham, this finally happens when the Lamb, when God himself provides the Lamb. Jesus, as we know, is the faithful Son who carries the wood for his own sacrifice, carries his own cross up the mountain, up the hill to Calvary. And Jerusalem would have been one of the hills in Mount Moriah, so that when Jesus is led outside of Jerusalem and crucified on the hill of Calvary, that would be one of the hills of Mount Moriah. That would have been one of the hills that Abraham had offered Isaac and that Isaac had offered himself. So Jesus is now truly the faithful Son, the true Lamb of God, whose sacrifice brings down blessing, brings Abraham's blessing to all the nations, not only to the Jews, but even now the Gentiles.